"Don't talk to the old lady," my daughter-in-law said sharply, her voice cutting clean through the polished marble lobby, as if I weren't even standing there, as if I were some inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than a person who had spent decades building the very family she now controlled. The hotel clerk froze mid-sentence, his polite smile faltering as his eyes flickered between Olivia and me, unsure which one of us he was supposed to acknowledge. And in that brief, uncomfortable pause, I felt something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I had imagined this trip differently. When Daniel first suggested a family vacation to Napa Valley, I thought it would be a chance to reconnect, to sit at long tables under soft evening lights, to laugh over shared meals and stories that still mattered. I paid for the suite upgrades without hesitation, covered the private tour reservations, even insisted on first-class airfare for everyone, telling myself that comfort was worth it if it meant we could all be together again, even if just for a few days. I had pictured my grandchildren running ahead of us in the vineyards, Daniel walking beside me like he used to when he was younger, asking me questions, listening, caring. Instead, I stood in a quiet corner of a five-star hotel lobby while my daughter-in-law decided, with a single sentence, that I was no longer someone to be spoken to. "She doesn't need the details," Olivia added, her tone lighter now, almost cheerful, as if she were smoothing over a minor misunderstanding rather than erasing me from the conversation entirely. The clerk nodded quickly, redirecting his attention to her, explaining the room keys, the dining credits, the spa reservations, all the things I had arranged, all the things I had paid for, all the things I was now apparently not meant to understand. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded calmly in front of me, the way I had learned to do over the years when emotions threatened to rise to the surface. No one corrected her. Not the clerk, not the other guests passing by, and most of all, not my son. Daniel stood just behind Olivia, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than anything she had said. For a moment, I thought he might step forward, might say something simple, something human, like, "Mom, that's not necessary," but he didn't. He just adjusted the strap of his watch and looked away, as if this moment didn't concern him, as if I were already someone outside the frame of his life. The lobby itself was beautiful in the way expensive places always are, soft golden lighting, fresh flowers arranged with quiet precision, the faint scent of citrus and polished wood lingering in the air, but none of it felt real to me anymore. It felt staged, like a backdrop for a scene I hadn't realized I was part of until it was too late to change it. I watched as Olivia accepted the room keys, her smile flawless, her posture confident, every movement suggesting control, and I realized that somewhere along the way, without ever announcing it, she had taken over not just the logistics of this trip, but the narrative of our entire family. And I had let her. Or perhaps I hadn't seen it clearly enough to stop it. Either way, the result was the same. I was standing in a place I had paid for, surrounded by people I had raised or welcomed into my life, and yet I had never felt more invisible. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply smiled, a small, quiet smile that didn't reach my eyes, and let the moment pass, because something told me that reacting now would only confirm the role she had assigned me, and I was no longer interested in playing that part. I followed them to the elevators without a word, the soft carpet muffling our footsteps as if even the hotel itself preferred silence over confrontation, and I noticed how naturally Olivia positioned herself in front, holding the room key packet like it belonged to her, like she had arranged every detail of this trip, while I walked a few steps behind, just close enough to be included, but far enough to be overlooked. And it was in that quiet distance that I began to understand something I had refused to see for years. The elevator doors opened with a gentle chime, and as we stepped inside, Daniel pressed the button for the top floor without asking anyone else, not even glancing in my direction, and I wondered when that habit had changed, when he stopped checking if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, if I was even paying attention. The ride up was short, but it felt longer, filled with the kind of silence that does not come from peace but from avoidance, and I watched the reflection in the mirrored walls, 3 people standing together, yet somehow not connected, Olivia scrolling through her phone, Daniel adjusting his jacket, and me standing still, hands folded, as if I were waiting for permission to exist. When we reached the suite, Olivia stepped forward again, unlocking the door with a practiced ease, and as it swung open, she walked in first, already speaking about dinner reservations and spa appointments, listing them quickly, efficiently, like a manager briefing her team, and I listened carefully, not because I needed the information, but because I recognized every detail. The private vineyard tour scheduled for the next morning. The sunset dinner overlooking the valley. The couple's massage appointment that she described as a necessity after the flight. I had arranged all of it weeks ago, sitting at my kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, making calls, comparing options, ensuring everything would be perfect, because I believed that if I created something beautiful enough, it would bring us closer again. I stepped further into the suite, taking in the view through the large windows, rolling hills stretching into the distance, bathed in late afternoon light, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel what I had originally hoped for, a sense of calm, of quiet satisfaction. But it faded quickly as Olivia continued speaking over me, around me, as if I were part of the furniture rather than the person who made this moment possible. "Margaret, your room is down the hall," she said eventually, her tone polite but distant, pointing toward a smaller adjoining space, and I nodded, even though I already knew the layout. Even though I had specifically chosen this suite because it allowed everyone privacy while still keeping us together. I walked toward the room she indicated, my steps measured, controlled, and when I closed the door behind me, the silence was immediate and complete. No voices, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of laughter drifting up from somewhere below. I set my purse down on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at the carefully arranged space, the crisp linens, the neatly folded towels, everything exactly as it should be, everything exactly as I had requested, and yet it did not feel like mine. I thought back to the past few years, to the small moments I had dismissed at the time, the times Olivia had answered questions directed at me, the times Daniel had deferred to her decisions without discussion, the holidays that had slowly shifted away from my home to hers. Each change subtle enough to seem reasonable on its own, but together forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. I remembered the first time she had corrected me in front of others, her voice light, almost playful, and how I had laughed it off, telling myself she did not mean anything by it, that it was just her way, that families evolve, that I needed to adjust. I remembered the times I had offered help, only to be told it was not necessary, that everything was handled, that I should relax, as if stepping back was a kindness rather than a quiet removal. And now, standing in a room I had paid for, in a trip I had planned, I realized that the distance I felt was not new. It had simply become impossible to ignore. I stood up slowly and walked back toward the window, looking out over the valley again, the light beginning to soften as evening approached, and I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even sadness, but clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong, and instead began to ask a different question, one that felt sharper, more precise, one that did not seek approval or understanding, but truth. And the truth was simple. I was not being forgotten. I was being replaced, and the person doing it was very careful to make it look polite. I did not return to the living room right away. Instead, I stayed by the window a little longer, watching the slow movement of cars pulling into the circular driveway below. Families stepping out, laughing, adjusting their bags, the kind of small, ordinary moments that used to feel familiar to me. And I realized how strange it was that I could recognize that warmth so easily in strangers while feeling none of it just a few feet away from my own family. When I finally stepped out of my room, I could hear Olivia's voice before I saw her, steady and confident, explaining dinner plans to someone on the phone, her tone warm in a way it had not been with me. And I paused briefly in the hallway, not to listen, but because I suddenly understood that there were two versions of her, the one she presented to the world and the one she reserved for me, and the difference between them was not accidental. I walked into the main living area quietly, and neither of them noticed at first. Olivia still speaking, Daniel sitting on the edge of the couch scrolling through his phone, and for a moment I simply stood there, observing, taking in the details I had overlooked before, the way Olivia spoke for both of them, the way Daniel nodded even when she was not looking at him, the way decisions seemed to move in one direction only. "Yes, just the two of us," she said into the phone, her voice light, almost cheerful, and something about those words settled heavily in the room, even though they were not meant for me. She ended the call a second later and turned, her expression shifting slightly when she saw me. Not surprised, not embarrassed, just briefly inconvenienced. "We have dinner at 7, she said, as if continuing a conversation I had never been part of. "So you might want to get ready early. It gets busy downstairs." I nodded again, the same small, controlled motion I had used earlier, and walked toward the kitchen area where a welcome tray had been arranged, a bottle of wine, 2 glasses already set out, and I noticed that there were only 2. I reached for a third glass from the cabinet, my movements slow and deliberate, not because I needed the wine, but because I wanted to see if anyone would acknowledge the imbalance. No one did. Daniel glanced up briefly, then back down at his phone, and Olivia began sorting through her bag, pulling out a folder with printed confirmations, flipping through them with quick efficiency, and I recognized the documents immediately, the ones I had emailed, the ones she had printed under her own name. "Everything looks good," she said, more to Daniel than to me. "I confirmed the spa and the tour. They are expecting us." Us. The word lingered in the air, small but precise, and I understood its boundaries without needing them explained. I poured myself a glass of wine and took a small sip, letting the taste settle, grounding myself in something tangible, something that was still mine, and I sat down in one of the chairs by the window, not joining them, not asking questions, just observing the quiet rhythm of their interaction. It was efficient, coordinated, almost rehearsed, and it struck me that they had been functioning like this for a long time, making decisions together, moving forward without me, not out of necessity, but out of preference. I thought about the calls I had made to arrange this trip, the hours spent comparing options, the careful planning that had gone into every detail, and how easily that work had been absorbed into a narrative that no longer included me as the source. Olivia closed the folder and placed it neatly on the table, her posture relaxed, satisfied, as if everything was under control, and in that moment, I realized that control was the one thing she valued most, not just over the trip, but over the perception of it, over who appeared to be responsible, who appeared to lead. I set my glass down and looked at them both, not with expectation, not with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet recognition that felt new and unfamiliar, and I understood that nothing I said in this moment would change what had already been established. So I said nothing. I simply sat there, present but unacknowledged, and let the silence stretch, because for the first time, I was no longer trying to fill it. By the time evening settled over the valley, the light outside had softened into a warm amber glow that filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the suite, and I stood in front of the mirror in my room, adjusting the collar of my blouse with slow, careful movements, not because anything needed fixing, but because I needed a moment to collect myself before stepping back into a space where I had already learned my place was uncertain. I chose a simple outfit, something elegant but understated, the kind of thing I had worn to countless family dinners over the years, always believing that showing up with quiet grace mattered more than drawing attention. And as I brushed my hair back, I caught my own reflection, and noticed how composed I looked, how steady, and I realized that this calm was no longer just habit. It was becoming something else, something deliberate. When I walked back into the main area, Olivia was already ready, her dress perfectly fitted, her posture confident, her phone in hand as she checked the time, and Daniel stood beside her, adjusting his cufflinks, both of them appearing as though they were about to step into an evening that belonged entirely to them. "We should leave soon," she said, not looking at me directly, but letting the words exist in the space between us, as if that was enough to include me. I nodded once, stepping closer to the door, and we moved together toward the elevator, the same quiet formation as before, Olivia leading, Daniel beside her, and me just behind, close enough to follow, far enough to be forgotten. The restaurant downstairs was exactly as I had imagined when I made the reservation weeks ago, soft lighting, white tablecloths, the low murmur of conversation blending with the faint clink of glasses, and as we were led to our table near the window, I noticed again how everything was arranged for two. 2 menus placed neatly side by side, 2 glasses already filled with water, and a third setting added slightly off to the side, as if it had been an afterthought. The hostess smiled politely at me, a brief moment of acknowledgement, and I returned it with the same quiet courtesy I had carried all evening, taking my seat without comment. Olivia immediately began speaking to the waiter, her tone smooth and practiced, asking about the specials, making small adjustments to the reservation, confirming details I had already confirmed days ago, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, even when I recognized the exact phrases I had used in my original call. Daniel followed her lead, agreeing with her suggestions, occasionally adding a comment, but never once turning to me for input, and it was in those small, repeated omissions that the pattern became undeniable. I picked up the menu and scanned it slowly, though I already knew what I would order, giving myself something to focus on, something that belonged to me alone in that moment. And when the waiter finally turned to me, his expression open and attentive, Olivia spoke again before I could respond. "She will have the salmon," she said lightly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if my preferences were already known, already decided, and the waiter hesitated just long enough to glance at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I met his gaze with a small, composed smile. "That will be fine," I said, my voice steady, not because I agreed, but because I understood that correcting her here would not change anything that mattered. The rest of the order continued in the same rhythm, Olivia leading, Daniel agreeing, and me existing just at the edge of their conversation, present but not participating, and I allowed it, not out of weakness, but because I was beginning to see the situation more clearly than I ever had before. This was not about one dinner, or one comment, or one moment in a hotel lobby. This was a structure, carefully built over time, reinforced through small decisions, quiet omissions, and unchallenged assumptions, and now that I could see it, I also understood something else. Structures like this do not collapse from a single confrontation. They shift when the foundation changes. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap and took a small sip of water, listening to the conversation continue without me. And for the first time since arriving, I felt a sense of distance that was not painful, but clarifying, as if I had stepped outside of something I had been trying too hard to remain inside. I did not need to interrupt. I did not need to correct. I only needed to understand, and once I did, the next step would become obvious. The food arrived with quiet precision, each plate placed carefully in front of us, as if the arrangement itself mattered more than the people seated at the table, and I watched as the waiter set my dish down last, slightly to the side, adjusting it so it aligned with the edge rather than the center, a small detail that mirrored everything else that had unfolded throughout the evening. Olivia thanked him with a warm smile, the same one she had used all night with everyone except me, and Daniel nodded in appreciation, already lifting his glass as she began speaking again, her voice smooth, controlled, filling the space with ease. I picked up my fork and took a small bite, tasting the meal I had chosen days ago, the flavors exactly as I had expected, and yet there was something distant about the experience, as if I were observing it rather than participating in it. Their conversation continued without pause, moving from travel plans to future projects, from shared acquaintances to inside jokes I did not recognize, and I listened quietly, not because I could not speak, but because I no longer felt the need to compete for space in a conversation that had already been defined without me. At one point, Olivia leaned slightly toward Daniel, lowering her voice just enough to create a sense of intimacy, and I noticed how easily he leaned in as well, how naturally their attention moved toward each other, forming a closed circle that did not include me. It was not rude in an obvious way. It was not loud or aggressive. It was something far more controlled, far more practiced, the kind of exclusion that does not draw attention because it looks like normal interaction to anyone watching from the outside. I set my fork down for a moment and reached for my glass, letting the cool water steady my thoughts, and I realized that what I was witnessing was not a single behavior, but a system, one that had been built slowly, reinforced over time, and maintained through consistency. Olivia did not need to raise her voice or make a scene. She only needed to guide the flow, to decide who spoke, who was acknowledged, who was necessary, and over time, those decisions had shaped everything. I thought back to earlier years, to holidays where I had been the one organizing dinners, setting the table, making sure everyone felt included, and I remembered how carefully I had paid attention to small details, making sure no one felt left out, no one felt secondary, because I believed that was what held a family together. And now, sitting at a table I had reserved, in a restaurant I had chosen, I understood that those same details could be used in reverse, not to include, but to exclude, not to build connection, but to redefine it. The realization did not come with anger. It came with a quiet clarity that felt almost clinical, as if I were studying something rather than experiencing it. I watched Olivia signal to the waiter for another bottle of wine, watched Daniel agree without question, and I noticed that neither of them looked toward me, not even out of habit. That was when I understood the most important part of all of this. It was not just that they were excluding me. It was that they no longer expected me to notice. I picked up my fork again and continued eating, maintaining the same calm expression I had carried all evening, and I allowed the conversation to move around me without resistance. There was a certain freedom in that, a distance that created space for observation, for understanding, for something else that had not been available to me before. Because once you stop trying to be included, you begin to see who is controlling the inclusion. And once you see that clearly, you also begin to understand where that control actually comes from. I finished my meal at a steady pace, not rushing, not lingering. And when the waiter returned to clear the plates, he paused briefly beside me, his expression polite, but with a hint of something else, something observant, and he asked softly if everything had been satisfactory. I met his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to register that I had heard him, that I was present, that I existed in this space despite everything else that suggested otherwise, and I nodded with a small, composed smile. Yes, I said simply, my voice calm and even. Everything is exactly as I expected. And for the first time that evening, I realized that statement was true in more ways than one. The check arrived quietly, placed at the edge of the table in a black leather folder, the kind that blends into the background unless you are the one responsible for what is inside. And I noticed immediately how Olivia reached for it without hesitation, her hand moving with the same confidence she had carried throughout the entire evening, as if this moment, like every other, belonged to her. She opened it briefly, glancing at the total, and then closed it again with a small nod, turning slightly toward Daniel, as if confirming something already understood between them. I will take care of it, she said, her tone light, almost generous, and Daniel responded with an easy agreement, the kind that suggested this was routine, expected, unquestioned. I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, not out of anticipation, but out of recognition. The waiter returned a few seconds later, standing just beside Olivia, waiting for the folder to be handed back, and she reached into her bag, pulling out her card with a smooth, practiced motion, placing it inside as if completing a simple task. There was no hesitation, no glance in my direction, no acknowledgement of the fact that every reservation, every arrangement, every charge associated with this trip had been made under my name. The waiter picked up the folder and stepped away, and I watched him walk across the room toward the payment station, his posture professional, unaware of the quiet shift that was about to take place. I had used the same card for years, the same account, the same details that had been saved across bookings and confirmations, and I knew exactly how the system worked, how the hotel processed charges, how authorizations were handled, how names and billing information aligned behind the scenes, even when they appeared differently on the surface. I did not need to interrupt. I did not need to explain. I simply needed to let the process continue. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair, relaxed now, satisfied, already moving on to the next part of the evening, discussing plans for tomorrow with Daniel, her voice steady and confident, as if everything was exactly as it should be. I listened without reacting, my attention split between their conversation and the quiet movements happening across the room, the waiter returning to the station, opening the folder, entering the card details, and then pausing, just for a moment longer than usual. It was a small pause, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but I was, and I saw the shift in his posture, the slight tilt of his head as he looked at the screen again, verifying something, and then glancing toward our table with a polite but uncertain expression. He walked back over, the folder still in his hand, his steps measured, careful, and when he reached us, he directed his attention not to Olivia, but to me. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice professional but slightly cautious. "This account is registered under your name. Would you prefer to use the card on file, or would you like to authorize a different method of payment. The question settled into the space between us with quiet precision, and for the first time that evening, the direction of attention shifted. Olivia's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise passing through her composure before she quickly recovered, turning toward me with a smile that felt newly constructed, as if it had been assembled in real time. Daniel looked up as well, his gaze moving from the waiter to me, a hint of confusion beginning to form as the assumptions of the evening started to unravel. I met the waiter's eyes with the same calm I had carried all night, my posture steady, my voice even when I spoke. "We will keep the account as it is," I said simply, my tone neither confrontational nor apologetic, just clear. The waiter nodded immediately, relief softening his expression as he returned to complete the transaction, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before, not empty, not avoidant, but charged with a new awareness that could not be ignored. Olivia adjusted her position slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table for just a moment before she relaxed them again, and Daniel shifted in his seat, looking at me in a way he had not all evening, not dismissive, not distant, but uncertain. I did not fill the silence. I did not explain. I simply reached for my glass and took a small sip of water, allowing the moment to settle exactly where it belonged, because for the first time since we arrived, the structure had shifted, not through confrontation, but through something far more effective. Clarity. We left the restaurant without speaking much, the quiet following us out into the cool evening air as the doors closed softly behind us, and I could feel the difference immediately, not in what was said, but in what was no longer certain. Olivia walked beside Daniel this time, but her steps were slower, less assured, her attention divided in a way it had not been before, and I noticed how she glanced at him more often, as if trying to re-establish something that had shifted without her permission. Daniel, for his part, was quieter than he had been all evening, his usual easy agreement replaced with something more measured, as if he were replaying the moment at the table, trying to understand how something so small could have revealed so much. I walked a few steps behind them again, but this time the distance felt different, not imposed, but chosen, and as we crossed the lobby, I noticed the same clerk from earlier standing at the desk, his posture straightening slightly when he saw me, his expression polite, but more attentive than before. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice respectful, and I returned the greeting with a small nod, acknowledging the shift without drawing attention to it. Olivia did not look in his direction. She continued walking, her focus fixed ahead, but there was a tension in her shoulders now, subtle, controlled, but present. When we reached the elevators, the silence followed us inside, heavier this time, filled not with avoidance, but with awareness. Daniel pressed the button again, but his hand lingered there for a second longer than necessary, and when the doors closed, he turned slightly toward me, his expression uncertain. "Mom," he said, the word sounding unfamiliar in the space between us, as if it had not been used in quite some time. "I did not realize you handled all the bookings." His tone was not accusatory, not even defensive, just confused, and I met his gaze calmly, not with disappointment, but with something steadier. "There are many things you have not realized," I replied, my voice even, not sharp, not cold, just clear, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to settle into him more deeply than any explanation could have. Olivia shifted slightly beside him, her posture tightening for a brief moment before she spoke, her voice carefully balanced. "I thought it was easier if I coordinated everything once we arrived," she said, her words measured, her tone reasonable, as if framing the entire situation as a matter of convenience rather than control. I turned my head just enough to look at her, not fully, not directly, but enough for her to understand that I had heard her. "And it was," I said quietly, and I left it there, because the truth did not need to be expanded, it simply needed to exist. The elevator doors opened onto our floor, and we stepped out together, the hallway quiet, the soft lighting casting long shadows that stretched ahead of us. And for a moment, none of us moved quickly, as if the rhythm of the evening had been disrupted, and had not yet found a new pace. When we reached the suite, Olivia paused at the door, her hand hovering over the key card before she finally unlocked it. And as we entered, the space felt different from when we had left, not because anything had changed physically, but because the understanding within it had shifted. Daniel walked in first this time, moving toward the window, his hands resting on the back of a chair as he looked out into the darkened valley, and I could see the weight of realization settling into him, not dramatically, but gradually, piece by piece. Olivia placed her bag down on the table, her movements controlled, deliberate, and for the first time, she did not immediately take the lead. She did not begin outlining plans or directing the next steps. She waited. It was a small thing, almost invisible, but it mattered. I walked past them both and set my glass down on the counter, the same steady motion I had used all evening, and I realized that nothing I had done had been loud, nothing had been confrontational, and yet something fundamental had shifted. Not because I had forced it, but because I had stopped allowing it to remain invisible. I turned toward them, not to address them, not to explain, but simply to exist in the space without stepping aside. And in that quiet moment, I understood that control does not always come from taking something. Sometimes, it comes from refusing to give it away any longer. The night stretched quietly after that, not with tension in the usual sense, but with a kind of careful stillness that made every movement feel more deliberate, more noticeable, and I could see it in the way Olivia adjusted her tone when she finally spoke again, softer now, measured in a way that suggested she was choosing her words instead of controlling them. "We should get some rest," she said, her voice almost neutral, and Daniel nodded. Though his attention was still distant, his thoughts clearly somewhere else, still circling the realization that had begun to take shape earlier in the evening. I did not respond right away. I walked slowly toward the window instead, looking out at the dark valley below, where small lights flickered in the distance, each one steady and self-contained, and for a moment I let myself stand therein. Silence, not because I needed time, but because I understood the value of it now. Behind me, I could hear them moving, quieter than before, their usual rhythm interrupted, and I realized that what had changed was not just their awareness of me, but their uncertainty about what I would do next. That uncertainty was new, and it was enough. I turned back toward the room and moved to the table where Olivia had left the folder earlier, the printed confirmations still neatly stacked, and I picked them up, not hurriedly, not secretly, but openly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I flipped through the pages slowly, recognizing every detail, every reservation, every note I had made, and I placed them back down with the same calm precision, letting the simple act speak for itself. Olivia watched me this time. She did not interrupt, but her attention followed my movements, her posture slightly more alert, as if she were beginning to understand that the structure she had relied on was no longer as stable as it had seemed. "Is everything all right?" she asked after a moment, her tone carefully balanced, not confrontational, but not dismissive either, and I met her gaze briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the question. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I replied, my voice even, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her expression again, the same brief shift that had appeared at the restaurant. Only this time it lingered a fraction longer. Daniel stepped closer then, his movements slower, more thoughtful, and he looked at the documents on the table before looking back at me. "You planned all of this," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I nodded once, not adding anything more, because the statement did not require confirmation, it required understanding. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the kind of silence that erased me. It was the kind that made space. Olivia glanced between us, her composure still intact, but thinner now, as if it required more effort to maintain, and I could see the calculations behind her eyes, the subtle adjustments, the attempt to regain control of a situation that no longer moved in only one direction. I walked toward my room without another word, not withdrawing, not retreating, but simply choosing my own space on my own terms, and as I closed the door behind me, I felt something settle into place with a clarity that had not been there before. I was not being pushed out. I had been stepping aside, and now I had stopped. I set my phone on the nightstand and sat down at the small desk near the window, opening the hotel app one had used to make the reservations, scrolling through the details with quiet focus, confirming what I already knew, that every booking, every charge, every authorization still traced back to me. The system had not changed. Only the perception had. I adjusted a few settings, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention immediately, just small, precise changes, the kind that would take effect gradually, reshaping the experience in ways that could not be easily reversed. I closed the app and leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting calmly on the desk, and I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of certainty. For the first time since arriving, I was no longer reacting to the situation. I was defining it. And I knew, with complete clarity, that by the time morning came, the balance would not look the same. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of soft, golden light slipping through the curtains that usually carried a sense of calm. But this time it felt different, clearer somehow, as if the day itself was waiting for something to unfold, and I was already awake before the alarm, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee I had made myself, watching the vineyard below come to life with slow, deliberate movement. I had always preferred mornings like this, steady, uninterrupted, a time when decisions could be made without noise, without interference, and I took my time finishing the last sip before standing up and getting ready, choosing the same quiet elegance I had carried the day before, nothing that demanded attention, but nothing that diminished me either. When I stepped out into the main area, Olivia and Daniel were already there, though something about their posture had shifted, less fluid, less certain, as if the ease they had relied on had not returned overnight. Olivia was checking her phone, her brows drawn together slightly, and Daniel stood near the counter, looking at the printed itinerary that I had placed there earlier. His expression focused in a way I had not seen in quite some time. The tour was moved, Olivia said, her voice controlled but edged with confusion, and the spa appointment is no longer under my name. She looked up then, directly at me this time, not around me, not past me, but at me, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about how much had changed. I walked over calmly, setting my cup down beside the documents, and glanced at the updated schedule without any sign of surprise. Yes, I said simply, my tone even. I made a few adjustments. The words settled into the room with quiet weight, not dramatic, not confrontational, but undeniable. Daniel looked between us, his confusion giving way to understanding, piece by piece, as he began to see not just what had happened, but how it had happened. Why? He asked, not sharply, but carefully, as if the answer mattered more than the question itself. I met his gaze steadily, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with clarity. Because I realized something yesterday, I said, my voice calm. This trip was never really about being together. It was about who was in control. Olivia straightened slightly, her posture firming as she responded, her tone measured but no longer effortless. I was just trying to organize things, she said, to make it easier for everyone. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without challenging it directly. And you did, I replied. You made it very clear how things were being handled. There was a pause then, not long, but significant, and in that silence, the balance shifted again, not through force, but through recognition. Daniel looked down at the itinerary once more, then back at me, and I could see the weight of realization settling more fully now, not just about the trip, but about everything that had led to this moment. Olivia did not speak immediately. She was watching, calculating, adjusting, but for the first time, she was not leading. I picked up the folder and closed it neatly, my movements unhurried, controlled, and I placed it back on the table with a quiet finality that did not need to be explained. The reservations are still there, I continued, just aligned correctly. Olivia's expression tightened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to reveal that she understood exactly what I meant. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, less certain, more grounded. Mom, he said, and this time the word sounded like it belonged. I did not see it. I held his gaze for a moment, not to judge, not to correct, but simply to let the truth exist between us. No, I said quietly, you did not. I stepped back then, not retreating, but repositioning, allowing space for what needed to come next, and I reached for my bag, picking it up with the same calm intention I had carried since the night before. I will be taking the earlier tour this morning, I said, my tone steady. You are both welcome to join, or you can keep your original plans. It was not a challenge. It was not a demand. It was a choice, clearly defined, equally available, and for the first time, it did not depend on anyone else's approval. Olivia looked at Daniel, then back at me, her expression composed but no longer certain, and Daniel hesitated for just a moment before nodding slightly. "We will come with you," he said, and I inclined my head once in acknowledgement, not as acceptance, but as recognition. I walked toward the door then, opening it without hesitation, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I did not look back, because I did not need to. Some things, once seen clearly, do not require further explanation. And as the door closed softly behind me, I understood that I had not taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving away what had always been mine.